The Gospels aren't the only ones that are reliable accounts of the life of Jesus. There are many other non-Christian descriptions of Jesus from the late 1st to 5th century.
Whoa, whoa, whoa! You just missed the point entirely.
Welcome back, everyone, to Bridge the Divide, where I examine irrational beliefs, the irrational behaviors that often follow, and how we, with education, rationality, and reason, can bridge the societal divides that they create. Today, we're going to take a look at a video by Christian YouTuber Leroy Kenton. Leroy runs the channel FTD Facts, which primarily focuses on Christian-centric top 10 lists. And the video we're looking at today is Leroy's top 10 extra-biblical evidences for Jesus. Now, I know what many of you are thinking, and yes, you are absolutely right, Leroy is missing the bigger picture here. And we will get there, but first, because individuals like Leroy don't have the greatest track record when it comes to intellectual honesty, we're going to check out what he says about the sources that he's citing to see if he's really delivering the goods so that his audience can get all of the relevant information they need before drawing any conclusions. The floor is yours, Leroy.
Welcome back to another FTD Facts episode. My name is Leroy Kenton, and today we're going to be looking at 10 of the biggest evidences of Jesus outside of the Bible.
It first has to be pointed out that anyone who has spent a fair amount of time studying the Bible is fully aware that the authors of the Gospels and other things like the Apocrypha had never met the individual now known as Christ and were not present at his execution. In fact, the character had been long dead before anyone decided to put ink to parchment or papyrus to make a record of the story. This little bit of information tells us that anything that has ever been written about the Christian Messiah character is hearsay, nothing more than stories that had been orally passed down for decades or in some cases even centuries. And given that the authors themselves are unknown in most cases, their sources are rarely, if ever, cited directly, and that the evidence shows us that the greater the length of time that stories are passed down orally, the greater the chances of embellishment, revision, or conflation, there is a reason why any claims made about Christ, especially the supernatural ones, are considered hearsay and therefore insufficient as evidence.
Now, we're going to be looking at some non-Christian pagan accounts, as well as some non-Christian Jewish accounts.
It's interesting that Leroy feels he needs to point out that some of the accounts that he's citing come from pagans and Jews, as if the Christian accounts alone could never possibly be affected by things like revisionism, embellishment, or subject to any other kind of bias.
So let's get started with this episode and look into the existence of Jesus outside of the Bible.
Okay, now let's see if Leroy at any point figures out that bigger issue that he seems to have conveniently forgotten.
At number 10, we have Thallus, 52 AD. Thallus is one of the oldest secular writers who mentioned Jesus in his writings.
Unfortunately, not much is known about Thallus himself. It is concluded by scholars that he was likely a Samaritan, an ethno-religious group originating from the ancient Israelites. It's also known that he was an early historian who wrote in Koine Greek. However, like the majority of ancient literature, his direct works have been lost to time.
He is so ancient that his work doesn't exist anymore.
Thallus' surviving work only exists in the works of other writers who quoted him. The estimate that scholars use to date Thallus' writings is primarily based on Theophilus of Antioch, who quoted Thallus and who himself died around 185 CE.
But you see, Julius Africanus quoted his writing where he tried to explain away the darkness occurring at Jesus' crucifixion.
Sextus Julius Africanus wrote about the Passion of the Christ in his Chronographiae, a history of the world in 5 volumes.
In his quote, he described that Thallus explained how the world was surrounded by a fearful darkness, as well as a massive earthquake happened during Jesus' crucifixion.
Yes, Africanus did quote Thallus regarding the story of Jesus' execution, the reported earthquake, and the global darkness that followed. He does, however, go on to dismiss the global darkness claim as nonsense, attributing it to nothing more than a solar eclipse. And so any darkness that was possibly experienced was only experienced by those who were present.
From Thallus' available work, we can conclude that Jesus lived, he was crucified, and that there was an earthquake and darkness at the point of his crucifixion.
But that's not quite all of it, is it, Leroy? Because after Africanus dismisses the global darkness as just a solar eclipse, he goes on to point out a major issue in Thallus' story, and that is that a solar eclipse could not occur at Passover when the moon is full, because at that time the moon would have been directly opposite the sun, making such an event impossible. Africanus' observation of this simple fact is predominantly the reason why modern scholarship considers the crucifixion darkness to be a literary creation instead of an historical event. We can also conclude from this that Thallus himself was not present at the crucifixion and was merely relaying a story that had been told to him.
Number 9 is Tacitus, 56 to 120 AD. Cornelius Tacitus was a well-known ancient historian known for his analysis and examination of historical documents.
To give some clarity here, Tacitus was a Roman politician and is also widely regarded by modern scholarship as one of the greatest Roman historians.
And he explained the existence of Jesus in his Annals of 116 AD.
Two major works of Tacitus survive today, the Histories and the Annals, covering the reigns of emperors Tiberius, Claudius, Nero, and the Year of the Four Emperors. Despite some substantial gaps, his works cover the history of the Roman Empire from the death of Augustus in 14 CE to the death of Domitian in 96 CE. And it is the Annals, which were also Tacitus' final work, that contains his writings regarding the story of Christ, the crucifixion, and the existence of Christians in early Rome.
Tacitus described Emperor Nero's response to the Great Fire in Rome and Nero's claim that the Christians were to blame for it.
This particular passage's context was the Great Fire of Rome, which occurred in 64 CE during the reign of Emperor Nero, and how Nero's blaming of the Christians for that fire led to the empire's first ordered persecution of them. Though it must be pointed out that shortly after the fire was quelled, rumors immediately began to spread throughout the empire that Emperor Nero, who was already considered a tyrant, had ordered the fire set himself to make space for his planned Domus Aurea. Tacitus' work is widely regarded by scholarship to be an authentic and valuable recounting of the events surrounding Christ's execution.
According to him, Jesus lived in Judea, he was crucified under Pontius Pilate, and he had followers who were persecuted for their faith in him.
It must also be pointed out that Tacitus himself, much like Thallus, was not present at the crucifixion, and what he wrote was taken from the Christians that were living in Rome at the time. Also, the final 4 books covering the reign of Emperor Nero suddenly cut off in Book 16, around 66 CE, leaving the coverage of Nero's final 2 years lost to history. It is also of note that the authenticity of the Annals has been challenged multiple times throughout history, while their complicated provenance presents its own serious issues.
Moving on to number 8, we have Mara bar Serapion, 70 AD.
Mara bar Serapion is purported to be an Assyrian Stoic philosopher who lived in the Roman province of Syria. The philosopher, regarded by scholars as a pagan, is known only from a single letter that he wrote in Syriac to his son, who is named Serapion.
After 70 AD, a Syrian philosopher named Mara bar Serapion wrote for his son, where he compared the life and persecution of Jesus with that of other philosophers who were persecuted for their ideas.
Mara bar Serapion's letter makes reference to the execution of the wise king of the Jews and the punishment that would befall those who executed him. The context for the reference was Mara bar Serapion expressing to his son that the wise are often persecuted for their wisdom, only for the persecutors to be eventually upended by the very wisdom they attempted to suppress.
Mara bar Serapion called him the wise king, and he described how Jews murdered their wise king, and after which their kingdom was abolished.
At best, it can be concluded that Mara bar Serapion was utilizing the story of the execution of the Christian leader to convey what he understood to be a very important philosophical lesson that he could pass on to his son.
He has also said that God avenged those men, and according to Mara bar Serapion's work, Jesus was a wise and influential man who died for his beliefs. The Jewish leadership was also somehow responsible for Jesus' death, and Jesus' followers adopted his beliefs and lived their lives accordingly.
Leroy also fails to mention here that the letter is actually considered rather controversial because nothing more about Mara bar Serapion exists. The letter itself cannot be ascribed any date, there are no Christian themes in the letter, and the references within the passages are extremely ambiguous because they contain no specific names or places. Thus, it is entirely possible that Marabar Serapion simply heard the story being passed around by traveling Christians and recognized an opportunity to impart a philosophical lesson to his son.
The next evidence comes from Phlegon, 80 to 140 AD. Like Thallus, Julius Africanus also mentioned a historian named Phlegon.
Phlegon of Tralles was a Greek writer who lived around the 2nd century CE under Emperor Hadrian. But it's in quoting Phlegon that things get a little complicated. Firstly, Leroy is incorrect here. There exists no surviving text where Sextus Julius Africanus cites Phlegon as he had done with Thallus. However, Origen of Alexandria, a 2nd century Greek ascetic Christian scholar, in his own apologetics work titled Against Celsus, does write that Phlegon of Tralles in his own chronicles mentions Jesus,
who wrote a chronicle of history around 140 AD. Phlegon also focused on the darkness surrounding Jesus' crucifixion, and according to Phlegon, Jesus had the ability to predict the future pretty accurately, and he was crucified under the reign of Tiberius Caesar. He also says that Jesus showed his wounds after he was resurrected to people that he came in contact with.
Origen of Alexandria wrote that Phlegon wrote about Jesus' ability to tell the future, his crucifixion, and an eclipse that was accompanied by an earthquake during the reign of Tiberius. While Leroy is correct in citing what Origen wrote about what Phlegon wrote, he interestingly leaves out Eusebius, a fellow 2nd century Greek Christian historian who directly quotes Phlegon in the 2nd book of his own chronicle. And in that quote that's attributed to Phlegon and utilized by Eusebius, neither Jesus nor a 3-hour darkness is mentioned. Whether accidental or deliberate is anyone's guess, but what we can conclude is that there is a major record-keeping issue here which puts Phlegon's credibility as a source into serious question.
Next up at number 6, we have Pliny the Younger, 61 to 113 AD.
Gaius Plinius Caecilius Secundus, better known as Pliny the Younger, was a lawyer, author, and magistrate of ancient Rome under Roman Emperor Trajan. During his life, he authored many letters, of which about 247 have survived to today, called the Epistulae. These missives are important because, while they dispensed with objectivity, they provide a record of the relationship between provincial governors and the imperial office, especially concerning how Rome opted to handle the growing issue of early Christians causing discontent in society, and some major historical events that Pliny was privy to, such as the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in which his uncle, Pliny the Elder, died. But it also has to be pointed out that Pliny's letters survived through copies that were made hundreds of years later, many of which differ in their readings from one another.
The early Christians were also described in the early non-Christian history. Pliny the Younger, in a letter to the Roman Emperor Trajan, he described the lifestyles of early Christians.
Well, there's a little more context to that, Leroy. As governor of the Bithynia and Pontus province in Anatolia, Pliny the Younger was faced with the difficult task of managing the growing early Christian community and dealing with the religious and social conflicts that seemed to continuously arise between the Christians and the Roman community.
Pliny explained how the Christians sang a hymn to Jesus Christ as a god in alternate verses and took an oath to refrain from all sorts of evil deeds.
Yeah, that was part of it, but not really the whole story. Around 112 CE, Pliny the Younger wrote a letter to Emperor Trajan asking for counsel on how to deal with the early Christian community. Pliny had found himself at a loss as to what to do because after conducting his own personal investigations, he discovered that the Christians were not guilty of any particular wrongdoing, apart from what he had considered to be harmless practices and depraved excessive superstition. However, because the early Christians had a growing reputation for extreme intractability and a disturbing willingness to die for their beliefs, Pliny wrote Trajan with concerns about the rapid spread of Christian practice and what he considered to be a growing potential for sedition.
The early description of the first Christians documents several things, like the first Christians believed Jesus was God and they upheld a high moral code, as well as early followers met regularly to worship Jesus.
Pliny's letter is considered by historians to be an accurate depiction of early Christian belief and practices and of how Rome viewed and dealt with them. It should also be mentioned that Trajan's reply back to Pliny revealed that persecution of Christians in Rome was not a result of imperial orders, but that persecutions were most often localized and sporadic throughout the empire. often the result of small Christian groups coming into conflict with their communities or direct conflict with the magistrate's laws. And while the majority of historians still view Pliny's letter as authentic, its authenticity has come into question on the basis of stylometric analysis.
Number 5 leads us to Lucian of Samosata, 115 to 200 AD.
Lucian of Samosata was a Hellenized Syrian satirist renowned for his tongue-in-cheek style when ridiculing superstition, the paranormal, and religious practices. Regarded as the inventor of the comic dialogue genre, Lucian is only known by his surviving works, and his prolific use of sarcasm throughout them makes them equally as hilarious as they are difficult to interpret.
Lucian was a Greek satirist who spoke sarcastically of Jesus and Christians, but in the process he actually affirmed that they were real people and never referred to them as fictional characters or anything like that.
That's not entirely accurate.
While Lucian never expressly stated that Jesus, Zeus, Jupiter, or any one of the hundreds of deities that were running around at the time were fictional, Lucian did make such a mockery of anything that was religious or superstitious. It is well understood from his writings that he did not believe that any of these figures were real, and that belief in them was, at least to him, the highest form of comedy.
Lucian, he explained how the Christians worshipped a man who introduced their novel rites and was crucified on this account. According to his work, we can conclude that Jesus taught about repentance and the family of God. Those teachings were then quickly adopted by Jesus' followers.
Oh, but there is so much more to Lucian's work than just that, Leroy. An extremely popular writer in antiquity, Lucian would go on to become an enormously widespread influence on Western literature. Lucian did mention the Christians in one of his satirical letters, thus giving an early pagan evaluation of Christianity. In his Passing of Peregrinus, he ridicules the Christians for their perceived ignorance and credulity, but does admit that he respects their morality. And in Alexander the False Prophet, he gives them credit for being one of the only few to ever challenge Alexander the Great's claim that he was a true prophet. The others being the Epicureans, who Lucian held as personal heroes, and of course Lucian himself. While Lucian did relate what he knew about Christian beliefs from what he observed and what he had been told by followers of the faith, he did so at their comical expense, clearly expressing that just like every other form of god worship that was going on in the land, he found them all equally ridiculous.
Moving on now to number 4, we have Celsus, 175 AD. Celsus was also quite antagonistic to the claims of the Gospels in the Bible, but in his criticism, he unknowingly affirmed and reinforced the biblical authors and their content.
Okay, that's a really twisted way of looking at things. Just because someone criticizes a belief system by pointing out its systemic flaws does not imply or entail that the belief system or anything included in the belief system is actually true. But let's get some better context here. Celsus was a 2nd century Greek eclectic philosopher and a fierce opponent of Christianity. His notable work, The True Word, survives only in quotations from it within the refutation work against Celsus written by Origen of Alexandria. Modern scholarship agrees that Origen's quotations of The True Word reveal that Celsus had a very strong understanding of both Christian and Jewish history, as well as an extensive knowledge of both the Old and New Testaments and the works of other 2nd century apologists as well.
So Celsus, he confirmed that Jesus was able to perform miracles. According to Celsus's writings, Jesus had an earthly father who was a carpenter, and he possessed unusual magical powers, and also he says that Jesus claimed to be God.
Wow, I've heard of paraphrasing, but this is kind of ridiculous. Celsus was a critical opponent of Christian dogma, and he focused his attacks by utilizing direct quotations from the Testaments to demonstrate why they didn't work. Celsus also reported that some Jews indicated that Jesus' father was actually a Roman soldier named Pantera, something that did not sit well at all with Origen. And in addressing the miracles of Jesus, Celsus concluded that if they had in fact occurred at all, then they were merely acts of black sorcery.
Celsus's writings is extensive, and he alluded to 80 different biblical quotes, and this would of course confirm their early appearance in history.
Yes, in order to properly critique the Christian belief, Celsus went straight to the source, the scriptures of their holy book. And while Celsus bitterly attacked what he saw as the Christian propensity for societal exclusivity, their refusal to cooperate with modern society, their condemnation of local customs and religions, and their conversion of the ignorant and vulgar while refusing to debate wise men, he was also, like so many others on this list, simply relating what he learned about Christianity from the Bible itself and the Christians and Jews that lived around him.
Josephus comes up next at number 3, 37 to 101 AD. Coming to the ancient hostile Jewish sources, Josephus is a Jewish source, right?
Well, let's break that down a little bit. Flavius Josephus was a 1st century Roman Jewish military leader and historian. Born in Jerusalem, he initially fought against the Roman Empire as the general of the Jewish forces at Galilee until their surrender in 67 CE to Vespasian. However, Josephus shrewdly used his knowledge of messianic prophecies to convince Vespasian that they foretold that he would one day become emperor of Rome. And in response, Vespasian kept Josephus on as a slave and interpreter. After 2 years of dedicated service, Vespasian would then grant Josephus his freedom, after which he then assumed the emperor's family name of Flavius. Josephus's notable works include the Jewish War, which was a record of the Jewish revolt against Roman occupation, and Antiquities of the Jews, which was a history of the world from the Jewish perspective written for the Romans. And it's in Antiquities of the Jews that Josephus makes 2 mentions of Jesus of Nazareth.
And Josephus wrote in detail about Jesus in his Antiquities of the Jews in 93 AD. Under the rule of Roman Emperor Vespasian, Josephus was allowed to write a history of the Jews where he wrote about Jesus as a wise man and the Messiah.
The first reference, called the Testimonium Flavianum, refers to Jesus as a Messiah and as a wise teacher who was crucified by Pontius Pilate. However, it must also be mentioned that virtually all modern scholars reject the authenticity of the present form of that passage, because the account was subject to heavy Christian interpolation and alteration. The second reference, which is widely acknowledged as authentic, mentions James, the brother of Jesus.
There are many ancient versions of Josephus's writings, but we can conclude that from them that Jesus lived in Palestine, the area known as Palestine, and he was a wise man, and he was also a teacher. He did amazing things, and he was accused by the Jews and crucified under Pilate, and had followers who were then called Christians.
Ultimately, due to myriad external influences, the veracity of Josephus's extant work regarding Jesus, beyond a simple recounting of information that was readily available at the time, remains questionable.
In the number 2 spot, we have Jewish Talmud, 400 to 700 AD.
It goes without saying that the Talmud, the record of rabbinical debates regarding the interpretation and application of the Torah, is, shall we say, less forgiving than the previously mentioned writers concerning the story of Jesus.
In the Talmudic writing, Jesus was referred to as Balaam ben Stada, or a certain one. And according to the Talmudic passages, Jesus practiced magic and he led Israel astray.
Well, that's certainly one way to put it, Leroy. 4 main passages in the Talmud are alleged to discuss the story of Jesus' life and death. But whether they actually do or don't is a rancorous subject that is still up for debate. What is written in the Talmud recounts a man named Ben Stada, who is considered a practitioner of black magic. His mother was named Miriam and also called Stada, and his father was named Pappus ben Yehuda. And apparently Miriam had an affair with a man named Pandira, from which Ben Stada was born. Some historians hold that Ben Stada, or Ben Pandira, was Jesus.
Jesus was stoned and hanged because he practiced sorcery and he enticed Israel to go astray, and no one came in his favor to plead, so he was hanged.
The Talmud makes reference to the capture of the notorious Ben Stada, who practiced witchcraft and was an idolater. And it mentions that he was executed by hanging on the eve of Passover. And while some interpret the Jewish use of hanging as a description of crucifixion, this is yet another point that is hotly contested.
Now, Jewish Talmud states that Jesus had magical powers, he led the Jews away from their beliefs, he had disciples who were martyred for their faith, and was executed on the day before Passover. Yeah, sounds very much like the accounts that were recorded in the Bible, just from a little bit of a different perspective though.
As usual, Leroy is just going to gloss over the biggest issue here. There exist many problems in correlating the events contained in the Synoptic Gospels with the Talmud, as a great deal of the information information is contradictory, which leads to many of the debates we have today. And it is also unknown precisely which side the contradictions exist on, Jewish or Christian, or how much of that information was subject to attempts at historical revision, which lets us conclude that the Talmud's value as evidence is equal to that of the Bible's, in that they're both oppositional and unverifiable anecdotes presented by two competing religions.
And finally, in at the number 1 spot, we have the Toledot Yeshu, 1000 AD. The Toledot Yeshu is a medieval Jewish retelling of the life of Jesus that is completely anti-Christian.
That is a pretty positive spin to put on what is arguably one of the most anti-Christian texts ever produced. The Toledot Yeshu is an early medieval Jewish text that is taken to be, shall we say, an alternative biography of Jesus of Nazareth.
The Toledot Yeshu attempts to explain away the miracles of Jesus and to deny the virgin birth.
The text is not considered canonical or even normative within rabbinic literature, and it depicts Jesus as an illegitimate child who practiced sorcery, seduced women, preached heretical Judaism, and died a shameful death. It's pretty much a recounting of what is alluded to in the Talmud, only a bit stronger in its profane portrayal of the Christian leader.
So, the text of the Toledot Yeshu does confirm many elements of the New Testament writings, like Jesus claiming to be the Messiah, and Jesus healing those who had disabilities.
Yes, the Toledot Yeshu incorporates many elements that appear in the Gospels that were already widely known at the time. Really, the only thing that could be drawn from the information available is that the Toledot Yeshu was organized as a hit piece on Christianity. One that has no intention of being intellectually honest, but is only interested in using what the Bible says to attack what the Bible says. Remember, Leroy, just because someone presents a valid critique of your worldview, it does not follow that they believe your worldview to be true, or even that it can be true, just that their critique holds up logically if your worldview is true.
So we can see that many elements of the biblical record are confirmed by these accounts, in spite of the fact that they were written against Jesus and his followers.
While the vast majority of scholarship agrees that the Toledot Yeshu represents a strong view into the acrimony of early Jewish-Christian relations, it cannot be concluded with any intellectual honesty that the repetition of biblical accounts in the Toledot Yeshu confirms that those events took place as depicted in reality. It should also be noted that the Toledot Yeshu's use as a polemic has resulted in it becoming fodder for Christian anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism. Nonetheless, the Toledot Yeshu falls squarely into the same category as the Talmud regarding the story of Jesus. And that's simply because so much external influence has been exerted upon the works, their ultimate veracity cannot be determined with any degree of certainty. So as we can see, Leroy here really doesn't give all the goods when it comes to the extra-biblical sources that he's citing. And that's probably because virtually everything in his video was taken directly from an article that appeared on this website, adefenseofthebible.com. Though I must point out that Leroy does add Celsus to the list and then omits Suetonius in favor of the Toledot Yeshu, and probably because Christians like him have been erroneously convinced that any criticism of Christianity actually affirms the truth of Christianity. Every single one of his points is a deceptive paraphrasing of the points made in that article. And given how poorly that article was researched, it stands to reason that's why Leroy's paraphrased video is so much worse. I mean, the article doesn't even have the author's name or even a date on it. And of its citations, the ones that aren't from Wikipedia are just a number of books and articles that were written by Christian apologists. So what Leroy has actually done, as others have done before him, is compile a list of sources that he thinks affirms the existence of the man named Jesus by repeating or criticizing information that was already widely available at the time. And I think it goes without saying that just because a person repeats, records, or criticizes what another person believes, it does not follow that those beliefs are also true, or even that the people repeating, recording, or criticizing them believe them to be true themselves. All that being said, ultimately, in their attempts to validate the claim of Jesus' existence on Earth, Leroy and the many others before him have completely missed the bigger picture, and that is that the mere existence of a man called Jesus is not really a point of contention, even among atheists. It is entirely possible that an itinerant rabbi named Jesus or Yeshua or Ben wandered the local countryside with his closest converts, preached heretical Judaism, pissed off the local authorities, and was summarily executed for his actions, as was the common practice in Rome when the authorities were pissed off, or feeling vindictive, or celebrating, or just plain bored. Let's just say the Romans were really into crucifying people. But by that understanding, Jesus would be nothing more than a Judaic offshoot cult leader, the David Koresh of Iron Age Palestine. The real point of contention that Leroy has completely missed is the purported divinity of Jesus. Just because the man potentially existed does not mean that he existed as he was depicted in the texts. The divinity of Christ is an entirely separate claim, and that's something that Leroy has conveniently decided to leave out. Because if the mere existence of Jesus alone entails that he was in fact divine in nature, then going by that logic, the mere existence of Muhammad logically entails that Allah exists, the existence of Siddhartha Gautama entails the truth of Buddhism, and the existence of New York City entails Spider-Man exists. In the end, we can see that Leroy's video is not intended as a critical examination, or even intends to provide actual evidence that supports the claim of Jesus' divinity. Leroy already understands that Christians will jump the gap between Jesus' existence and his purported divinity themselves. Because for them, if Jesus wasn't divine, then it would be no different than if he hadn't existed at all. Leroy's video is only designed to play upon that Christian credulity, that weakness that was easily identified by individuals like Celsus and Lucian of Samosata. It's meant to be the metaphorical pat on the back that Christians so desperately desire simply for believing what they believe. And in return for perpetuating that intellectual dishonesty, he gets the clicks, views, and impressions that he needs to keep his channel growing and relevant. Because let's face facts, what would Christianity really be if it wasn't constantly offering up prime real estate for people to exploit others for their own profit? Thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, please like, share, and subscribe, and hit that bell for notifications. And be sure to leave a comment below. I love reading your responses, and those interactions help with the dreaded algorithm. Don't forget, April is Child Abuse Prevention Month. A link on how you can support these important efforts is down in the description. And if you love scary movies, be sure to check out me and my filmmaker friends over at the Week in Horror podcast, now in our 4th season. Everything you need to become a channel member here, get yourself some official Bridge the Divide gear, support the podcast, or even get your own official Darth, Dawkins Squeak toy is in the description below. Once again, thank you all so much for your continued support. And as always, be safe, be excellent to each other. And together, we can bridge the divide.
At least I have chicken.